Now, I think you lot are quite up to date with the workings of the police force, but one area that I think we struggle a little bit is the aspects of law enforcement between the medieval period and the industrial period. So that's where I'm going to focus more of my attention, but we will start in the medieval period. So very quickly, one of the big bits of medieval law enforcement is this idea of collective responsibility. Now we have the police force do it all. Then it was everybody's responsibility to make sure the law was enforced. So they had things which you'll know about, like tithings, where every man over the age of 12 had to get into a tithing, and they had to look out for each other and make sure each other were keeping on the right side of the law, and hue and cry, where they all had to down tools and chase a criminal if a crime was going on. Each village had its own village constable. Most people at the time lived in villages. They had to maintain law and order. They were a volunteer, they weren't paid, but it's an area of responsibility where you get a bit of powers and sometimes some benefits. But you would have to lead the hue and cry if a crime was committed. You would have to organise people into the tithings, and you had to regularly meet the sheriff. Well, who is the sheriff? Let's find out. Well, the sheriff's appointed by the monarch. He's responsible for maintaining peace in the whole shire, which is a much larger area than just a village. They would be in control of lots of different villages. They would meet with their local village constables, find out what's been going on, see if there's anything needs doing. They would appoint the local judges as well. Not the main judges, the royal judges were appointed, of course, by the king, but they would do that too. Something else that was introduced in the medieval period, or the Middle Ages, was in 1194, Richard I introduced coroners. Now, coroners are not detectives. Coroners just try to work out how somebody died, not who did it. They still exist today, but they're not. They were introduced to investigate suspicious deaths when it wasn't clear exactly how somebody had died. Now, Richard I was clearly quite a busy man because he also introduced. There must have been parts of the country under his rule where there was greater trouble, rough areas, if you like. So he put some knights in charge of those areas. He said, "You're going to be called a keeper of the king's peace." By the time of Edward I, he decided that had been such a good idea, he was going to extend it to all areas, and they got a new title, which was Justices of the Peace. They were to meet 4 times a year to dish out justice, to listen to different problems in their local areas, and to decide who's guilty, not guilty, what any punishment should be, that sort of thing. Very important role, a volunteer role, not paid, but one with great power, because you had the power to punish. So why would people do it if they don't get paid? Well, if I said to you, would you like the power to give detention out? You'd be like, yes, I do. I'd say, no, I'm not paying you. They'd be like, why would you pay me? I want that power. There you go. So that's medieval law enforcement. And so to the early modern period, and actually things stayed largely the same because most people still lived in rural areas, villages. Tithings, hue and cry, constables, coroners, all of those things still existed. The changes that happened in the early modern period tended to happen in the urban areas, towns and cities, because the population was increasing in this period, and it was resulting in larger towns and cities where things like tithings and hue and cry, they didn't really work, they needed something else. So one thing they introduced was a town constable. Different to a village constable because these guys are paid. They would be people of a good reputation. The local shop owners, they had a good interest to have low crime areas. Shop owners and merchants, that sort of thing. So they'd choose somebody together, the local townspeople, to be the town constable. They would have the power to arrest people. They would have to round up vagabonds, which was obviously an issue in the early modern period. So that's a town constable. But they had some people helping them out. The people helping them out was everybody, because everybody in a town, or every man, sorry girls, had to be on a rota to do a shift or 2 during the month as a night watchman. They were on a rota, so everybody had a turn. I guess it would depend how many people were in the area, how regular your turn was. 10 PM till dawn, they had to report to the town constable, who I'm assuming was asleep at that time. Of course, this is open to abuse, because this is just everybody. So if you were a criminal, you could help your criminal gang out on the particular night you were night watchman by not being in the place to night watch things. that are going on that shouldn't be, and so on and so forth. It's not the greatest system, but again, it's collective responsibility, just in a slightly different way. Because law enforcement was not particularly effective, not very good, they also had some private law enforcement that people with a bit of money could use, and they had thief takers, like bounty hunters, I suppose. They would be, the sort of Wild West of this person has committed a crime, given a description, names, or any other details if they had them, and the thief takers would go and catch these people and hand them in, get the reward. Of course, this was also open to abuse, so sometimes criminal gangs would set up as thief takers, and they would just capture people from rival gangs and hand them in as the culprit, and well, so on and so forth. So none of these systems are particularly perfect. It's until we get the police, of course. But let's move on to what happened before the police in the industrial period. So, 1829, you got the police force, but the industrial period lasted from the 1700s to the 1900s, according to our textbook. So, some towns, because they'd grown even larger, had increased the number of paid town watchmen or constables that they had. The army was also used more during the industrial period if there was any big protests, more people complaining, plenty of protests in this time, so the army would be used in those particular times. So there's a lot of continuity again, but there's also some change afoot before the police. Now, one of the biggest elements of law enforcement to know about in the industrial period was the Bow Street Runners. They acted as kind of like a good example that inspired the government to create the actual police force. This was a group of a couple of brothers, the Fielding brothers, who set up as magistrates. So they were sort of judges, if you like, hearing court cases in a place called Bow Street in London. But they could see crime had got out of hand, so they set a group up as the Bow Street Runners to try to catch criminals. Through catching them, it would deter criminals. They knew information was key, so they would collect information and act as an information point, publish information so people could read about crimes and descriptions of suspects. They even set up horse patrols, men on horseback to patrol around London, looking for highwaymen. They were incredibly successful, and because they were so successful, to give one example, the highwayman issue stopped for a while whilst they were patrolling London. Because they were so successful, it inspired the government to go, oh well, they've been very successful, perhaps we could do something like that. And that was one of the reasons, of a number, which led to the creation of the police force in 1829.